The self is not the solid center we believe it to be. It is a construction, a fragile narrative the mind repeats in order to feel continuous. Human beings insist on the comfort of a single identity, one voice, one will, one stable inner core. Yet beneath that comforting illusion lies something far more unsettling. The mind is not one, it is many. Long before modern psychology began dissecting personality, one writer had already confronted this fracture directly. Fernando Pessoa saw what most people refuse to face. The self is not discovered, it is composed, and sometimes it is divided beyond recognition. In an era when society still believed the individual possessed a unified soul, Pessoa quietly dismantled that assumption. Through his strange literary experiment of multiple heteronyms, he revealed a disturbing possibility. What if the voice we call I is only one actor among many inside the same consciousness? What if identity itself is a story invented to prevent psychological chaos? Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. Yet the question remains unavoidable. If the self is not one, then who exactly is living your life? Pessoa did not treat this as abstract philosophy. He turned his own mind into a laboratory. Inside one man emerged several thinkers, poets, and observers, each with their own worldview, their own emotional logic, their own truth about existence. The outline of this exploration unfolds through 10 philosophical movements that examine the fragmentation of identity and the strange architecture of consciousness itself. And to understand this radical vision, we must begin where the illusion first cracks. The moment the self stops pretending to be one. The self is not the solid center we believe it to be. It is a fragile construction, a narrative woven moment by moment so that consciousness does not collapse into chaos. What we call identity is not a stable core, but a story told with such persistence that we begin to mistake repetition for truth. Strip away the comforting language of unity, and something unsettling appears beneath it. The human being is not one voice, but a crowd. Most people never confront this possibility. They move through life convinced that the I speaking today is the same I that spoke yesterday. Memory creates continuity. Habit creates coherence. Society demands consistency. Yet beneath that surface order lies a restless multiplicity. Thoughts contradict each other. Desires collide. Decisions emerge not from a single will, but from an invisible negotiation between competing impulses. The self appears unified only because consciousness edits the noise. What if that unity is an illusion we desperately need in order to function? Long before modern psychology began to dissect identity, long before neuroscience mapped the fragmented architecture of the mind, a quiet figure in Lisbon was already confronting this fracture with unsettling clarity. Fernando Pessoa understood something that the 20th century would only slowly begin to articulate. The self is not a singular entity. It is a constellation of perspectives that temporarily cooperate under the name of one person. When the world still believed that individuality meant coherence, Pessoa saw the cracks. When society insisted that authenticity meant discovering one true inner voice, he suspected that such a voice might not exist at all. His life and work did not merely describe this fragmentation, they enacted it. His writing became a laboratory in which the illusion of a stable self was exposed, dismantled, and examined. This insight begins with a simple yet brutal claim. The ego is not a stable substance. It is a narrative device. Human beings experience life as a sequence of moments that must somehow form a continuous story. Without that story, existence would feel disjointed and incomprehensible. The mind therefore performs a quiet act of construction. It arranges memories, emotions, and intentions into a coherent line that we call identity. But coherence is not the same as truth. The story of the self is an interpretation, not a foundation. Consider the way a person speaks about their own past. They describe childhood, choices, failures, ambitions. Each event is woven into a narrative that explains who they are today. Yet that narrative is constantly revised. New interpretations replace old ones. What once seemed like destiny becomes mistake. What once felt meaningless becomes defining. The self that tells the story changes, and therefore the story itself changes. This reveals a disturbing possibility. The I that claims continuity may simply be the latest narrator in a long succession of inner voices. Here, the first misunderstanding must be confronted and rejected. Many assume that identity is discovered, as if somewhere deep within us there exists a true self waiting to be uncovered. But this belief confuses stability with authenticity. The Soa's perspective suggests something far more radical. Identity is not discovered, but composed. We are not excavating a hidden essence. We are constantly assembling a temporary arrangement of thoughts and feelings that gives the appearance of unity. The self is less like a stone and more like a performance that never fully repeats itself. The implications of this idea are profound and uncomfortable. If the ego is constructed, then the sense of being a single person is partly an illusion created for psychological survival. That illusion protects us from the overwhelming complexity of our inner life. Without it, the mind would be forced to acknowledge its own multiplicity. And this multiplicity is not a minor detail of personality. It is the structure of consciousness itself. Inside every human being exist conflicting tendencies that rarely agree. One part seeks security, while another demands risk. One voice desires discipline, while another longs for escape. One moment we are generous, the next we are selfish. One day we believe deeply in a principle, the next day we question it. These contradictions are often interpreted as weakness or inconsistency, yet they reveal something more fundamental. The self is not a single authority issuing commands. It is an arena. Within that arena, countless impulses compete for influence. Consciousness does not eliminate the conflict. It merely organizes it into a story that appears stable enough to sustain daily life. The illusion works because it simplifies complexity. We say, I decided, but the truth is more complicated. A decision is the result of internal negotiation. Pessoa grasped this with remarkable clarity. He recognized that the unity of the ego was not a fact, but a convenience. Instead of hiding this fragmentation, he exposed it. Instead of defending the idea of a single identity, He allowed multiple identities to emerge within his work. But before we reach that extraordinary experiment, the deeper philosophical question must be confronted. Why do human beings resist the idea that the self is fragmented? The answer lies in existential fear. A stable identity gives life structure. It creates the feeling that our experiences belong to a coherent story moving toward meaning. Without that sense of continuity, existence begins to feel unstable. If the self changes constantly, then what exactly is living this life? Who is responsible for choices? Who endures suffering? Who pursues purpose? The mind answers these questions by inventing a center. That center becomes the ego. It becomes the narrator who claims ownership over thoughts, emotions, and memories. The ego says, "This is me." And because that statement feels necessary, we rarely challenge it. But the moment we question the solidity of that center, a strange psychological tension appears. The self begins to feel less like a fixed entity and more like a shifting perspective moving through experience. Identity becomes fluid. Certainty weakens. The narrative of who we are starts to tremble. This is the point where many people retreat. They return quickly to familiar assumptions. They rebuild a comforting story of a unified self. Yet philosophers and artists sometimes choose a different path. Instead of restoring the illusion, they explore the fracture. Pessoa was one of them. He did not treat the fragmentation of identity as a theoretical puzzle. He treated it as a lived reality. In his writings, the self becomes porous, unstable, and multiple. Different voices emerge with distinct ways of seeing the world. Each voice feels authentic. Each voice carries its own emotions, its own reasoning, its own worldview. What appears at first to be contradiction slowly reveals a deeper philosophical insight. The human being is capable of containing many perspectives simultaneously. Modern life makes this truth even more visible. In the contemporary world, people constantly shift between roles and identities. One self appears at work, another in private life, another in solitude, another in digital spaces. Technology has not created this fragmentation. It has merely made it more obvious. The illusion of a single, consistent personality becomes harder to maintain when our thoughts, expressions, and desires change across contexts. Yet despite this evidence, many still cling to the belief that somewhere beneath these shifting roles, there must exist a stable core. The search for that core has become a cultural obsession. Books promise self-discovery. Therapies promise to reveal the authentic self. Motivational voices insist that clarity of identity is the key to happiness. But what if the search itself is misguided? What if the discomfort we feel is not a sign that we have lost our true self, but a sign that the idea of a single true self was never accurate to begin with? Existential psychology forces us to confront this possibility. Human beings crave certainty about who they are because uncertainty threatens our sense of control. A stable identity suggests predictability. It suggests that our actions emerge from a consistent source. But the deeper we examine our inner life, the more that stability dissolves. We find impulses we cannot fully explain. We discover beliefs that change unexpectedly. We encounter emotions that contradict our own values. Instead of unity, we find movement. Pessoa did not interpret this movement as a defect. He saw it as the reality of consciousness. Within each individual lies not a single self, but a shifting field of possibilities. Each possibility contains its own way of perceiving the world. Some remain quiet, others dominate for a moment and then disappear. The self becomes less like a statue and more like a landscape, constantly reshaped by internal forces. This perspective does not offer comfort, it demands honesty. To acknowledge the fragmentation of the self is to abandon the comforting myth that we fully know who we are. It forces us to recognize that identity is unstable, that certainty about the self may always be provisional. The person we believe ourselves to be today may not be the same person who speaks tomorrow. And yet, this recognition also opens a strange form of freedom. If the self is not fixed, then identity is not a prison. The multiplicity within us becomes a source of possibility. Instead of searching endlessly for a single definitive version of ourselves, we begin to see that human existence contains many potential selves waiting to emerge. Pessoa understood this not as a theory, but as an experience that shaped his entire intellectual life. Through his writing, he began to explore what happens when the illusion of unity is deliberately abandoned and the many voices inside a person are allowed to speak in their own distinct forms. And as those voices gradually step forward, each carrying its own philosophy and vision of the world, the reader begins to encounter something extraordinary. Not merely a writer, but a human mind unfolding into multiple lives. And once the first fracture in the idea of a single self has been exposed, the inevitable question rises with quiet intensity. If one person can contain many voices, who exactly are the others waiting inside the same consciousness? The moment we accept that the self is not singular, a more disturbing realization emerges. If the human mind contains many voices, then each of those voices carries its own way of seeing the world. Identity stops being a discovery and becomes an act of creation. The person we believe ourselves to be is not uncovered like a buried artifact. It is constructed, assembled, and sustained through continuous choice. Fernando Pessoa did not merely suspect this, he demonstrated it with ruthless precision. Where most thinkers stop at describing the fragmentation of the self, Pessoa pushed the idea into an extreme experiment. Instead of writing under one identity, he created multiple authors within himself. Not pseudonyms in the ordinary sense, not masks hiding the same voice. These were complete personalities with their own philosophies, temperaments, and visions of existence. Each one lived inside the same consciousness. This act was not literary decoration, it was philosophical surgery. Pessoa cut open the illusion of a single identity and allowed the different inhabitants of his mind to stand as independent thinkers. Each one looked at reality from a distinct angle. Each one rejected the assumptions of the others. Through them, the inner multiplicity of the human being became visible. But before examining these figures, a deeper question must be faced. Why does the idea of multiple selves feel so unsettling? Why do we instinctively resist the possibility that more than one personality may exist within our inner life? Because unity gives us psychological stability. Human beings are trained from childhood to believe that identity must be coherent. Society rewards consistency. Education demands a stable character. Morality assumes a responsible individual whose actions originate from a clear center of will. The idea that one person might contain several distinct perspectives threatens that structure. If the self is multiple, then certainty dissolves. Which voice is the real one? Which desire represents the authentic will? Which belief defines the person? Once plurality enters the mind, the concept of a fixed identity begins to collapse. And yet, if we observe ourselves honestly, we already know this multiplicity exists. Think about the silent debates that occur inside every human mind. One part of you wants safety, another demands adventure. One voice insists on discipline, another whispers temptation. One moment you feel courageous, the next moment you hesitate. These are not small fluctuations within a single personality. They are the presence of competing perspectives that struggle for influence. Most people suppress this complexity. They reduce the conflict into a simplified narrative called personality. But Pessoa chose the opposite path. He gave each voice its own existence. The result was extraordinary. He invented what he called heteronyms. These were not simply fictional authors. They were fully formed individuals with biographies, styles of thought, and philosophical positions that often contradicted one another. Each one wrote as if they were a real person inhabiting the world. In doing this, Pessoa reveals something profound about human identity. Personality is not a fixed object waiting to be discovered. It is a structure that can be built. One heteronym might see the world through pure sensation, another through disciplined reason, another through overwhelming emotion. Each identity becomes a lens through which reality is interpreted. And because these lenses differ radically, the world itself appears different depending on who is looking. This is the second misunderstanding that must be confronted. People often assume that personality is something hidden inside us, something we must uncover in order to become authentic. But this belief ignores the creative dimension of consciousness. The self does not simply exist. It is continuously shaped by perception, memory, imagination, and language. Pessoa's heteronyms expose this process with brutal clarity. Each of his internal authors possesses a complete worldview. Their thoughts do not merely differ in tone, but in structure. They interpret existence according to entirely different philosophical assumptions. In other words, each identity constructs a different reality. This means that the world we experience is not independent from the self experiencing it. Our personality shapes the meaning of everything we see. If one self values calm observation, the world becomes quiet and simple. If another self burns with restless ambition, the same world becomes electric and chaotic. Reality does not change, yet its interpretation shifts dramatically depending on the inner voice that dominates consciousness. Pessoa turned this psychological truth into a literary universe. Inside him lived thinkers who disagreed about the nature of existence. One believed in pure perception without interpretation. Another believed in disciplined acceptance of fate. Another exploded with the intensity of modern industrial life. Each identity argued with the others through poetry, essays, and reflections. The result was not confusion, it was revelation. Through these figures, Pessoa demonstrated that the human mind contains multiple possible ways of being. We are not limited to a single psychological structure. Within us lie many potential personalities, each capable of organizing experience in a different way. This insight becomes even more striking when we compare it with the modern world. In the 21st century, identity has become fluid in ways previous generations rarely experienced. People reinvent themselves across careers, cultures, and digital spaces. Social platforms allow individuals to present different versions of themselves simultaneously. One identity exists in professional life, another in private communication, another in anonymous online environments. Technology did not invent multiplicity, it simply exposed it. Even in 2025, many still cling to the comforting myth of a unified self. We speak about authenticity as if it means discovering one definitive personality beneath all others. But everyday experience contradicts this belief. The person you are with friends is not the same as the person you are in solitude. The self that appears in public is not the same as the one that emerges in quiet reflection. Pessoa anticipated this reality long before it became visible in modern culture. He understood that the human being is not a single psychological entity, but a field of possibilities. Within that field, different identities can emerge, depending on circumstance, emotion, and thought. Instead of denying this plurality, he explored it deliberately. Yet, this exploration raises a deeper existential tension. If we accept that multiple selves exist within us, how do we live with that knowledge? The answer is not simple. Multiplicity creates both freedom and instability. On one hand, it expands the horizon of what a person can become. On the other hand, it threatens the coherence necessary for action. Too many voices inside the mind can paralyze decision. Too many perspectives can dissolve certainty. This is the paradox at the heart of self-awareness. To see the multiplicity within us is to recognize our own complexity. But that recognition can also destabilize the sense of direction that allows us to move through life confidently. The more clearly we observe the many voices inside us, the harder it becomes to claim that any single voice defines who we are. Pessoa did not escape this tension. He lived inside it. His heteronyms were not merely intellectual exercises. They were manifestations of a mind deeply aware of its own fragmentation. Each identity represented a way of confronting existence. Each offered a different answer to the question of how to live. But among these internal figures, one voice stands at the center of the experiment, a quiet observer who rejects complexity and insists on something radically simple, a perspective that strips away philosophy itself and demands a direct encounter with the world as it appears. Through this figure, Pessoa explores a startling idea. Perhaps the greatest obstacle between human beings and reality is not ignorance, but thought itself. And if that suspicion is true, then the next step in this philosophical journey will require confronting a voice that refuses interpretation altogether and insists on seeing the world exactly as it is. Reality does not require explanation, it requires attention. The world exists before our interpretations, before our theories, before the restless machinery of thought begins to dissect it. Yet human beings rarely experience reality in its raw form. We translate it immediately into meaning, judgment, and narrative. We do not see the world. We think about the world. This is the third fracture in the illusion of the unified self. Once multiple voices emerge within the mind, the question becomes unavoidable. Which of these voices sees reality most clearly? Which perspective speaks with the least distortion? And what happens when one of those voices refuses the entire tradition of interpretation itself? Among the many figures that emerge from Pessoa's internal universe, one stands with disarming simplicity. Alberto Cairo does not argue about metaphysics. He does not speculate about the nature of existence. He rejects philosophy almost entirely. His radical claim is blunt. The world does not need to be explained. It needs to be seen. This position may appear naive at first glance, but its implications are devastating. For centuries, philosophers believed that understanding reality required deeper analysis. They searched for hidden structures beneath appearances. They assumed that what we perceive with our senses must be incomplete, that truth hides behind the surface of things. From Plato to modern thinkers, the intellectual tradition often treated the visible world as a shadow of something more fundamental. Cairo destroys this assumption with a single gesture. The tree is not a symbol. The tree is a tree. The wind does not represent anything. It simply moves. The river does not hide a metaphysical secret. It flows. Reality is complete in its appearance. This position strips thought of its authority. It exposes the human habit of overthinking the world as a psychological reflex rather than a path to truth. According to this view, interpretation does not reveal reality. It distances us from it. And here the deeper existential question arises. Why are human beings so addicted to explanation? The answer lies in anxiety. Thought promises control. When we analyze the world, we feel as if we are mastering it. Concepts give us the illusion that reality is predictable, structured, and understandable. But that comfort comes with a hidden cost. The more we interpret the world, the less we encounter it directly. Instead of experiencing a landscape, we categorize it. Instead of feeling the presence of a moment, we analyze its meaning. The mind becomes a filter that transforms immediate experience into abstract thought. Sayero refuses that filter. His philosophy is almost brutally simple. To see a flower is enough. To feel sunlight is enough. The world does not demand interpretation in order to exist. It only demands perception. At first, this sounds like anti-intellectual rebellion, but the deeper logic is psychological rather than philosophical. Cairo recognizes that thought often separates us from the present moment. The mind is constantly moving between memory and anticipation. It reconstructs the past and imagines the future. Rarely does it remain fully inside the immediacy of experience. This restless movement creates a subtle alienation. Human beings begin to live more inside their thoughts than inside the world itself. They analyze emotions instead of feeling them. They explain beauty instead of encountering it. The directness of experience becomes buried beneath layers of interpretation. Cairo's radical insight is that reality does not need to be translated into ideas. It simply needs to be seen. Pessoa created this voice not as a poetic ornament, but as a philosophical counterforce to the complexity of his other identities. If the mind contains multiple perspectives, then one of them must represent the possibility of pure perception, a way of being in which the world appears without intellectual interference. Cairo embodies that possibility. He observes fields, trees, rivers, and sky without transforming them into symbols. He refuses metaphysical speculation. He distrusts the idea that reality hides behind appearances. For him, the visible world is already complete. The act of seeing becomes the highest form of understanding. This idea confronts one of the deepest habits of modern consciousness. We assume that knowledge requires explanation. We believe that thinking more deeply about the world will bring us closer to truth. Yet Sairo reverses that assumption. According to him, excessive thinking may actually move us further away from reality. Because the moment we begin to explain the world, we stop simply experiencing it. Modern life intensifies this distance. In the contemporary world, the mind is constantly stimulated by information. Screens deliver endless streams of interpretation, commentary, and analysis. Every event becomes an object of discussion. Every experience is immediately translated into opinion. Silence disappears. Direct perception becomes rare. Even in 2025, the human mind struggles to remain present. We look at landscapes through cameras. We measure moments through productivity. We interpret emotions through psychological frameworks. The world becomes a series of concepts rather than a field of immediate experience. Cairo's voice cuts through this noise with unsettling clarity. He reminds us that the world existed long before human interpretation appeared. The mountains did not wait for philosophers to explain them. The wind did not require poetry to justify its movement. Reality does not depend on human thought in order to be real. And yet human beings constantly attempt to impose meaning upon it. This impulse reveals something important about the structure of consciousness. The mind does not tolerate emptiness easily. Pure perception feels unstable because it lacks explanation. The intellect rushes to fill that space with ideas, theories, and symbols. We build complex narratives about existence because silence feels uncomfortable. Cairo exposes this habit as unnecessary. To stand in front of a tree and simply see it requires a rare psychological discipline. It demands the suspension of interpretation. It requires the courage to encounter reality without transforming it into a concept. This is not ignorance. It is a form of radical presence. Through Cairo, Pessoa demonstrates that perception itself can become a philosophical stance. Instead of searching for hidden meanings, one can choose to encounter the world directly. The act of seeing becomes an existential commitment to reality as it appears. But this position also reveals a paradox. If pure perception is possible, then why do human beings so rarely live in that state? Why does thought constantly return to dominate experience? The answer lies in the structure of the self. Earlier, we saw that the human mind contains multiple voices. Each voice organizes experience in its own way. Some voices crave explanation, others crave emotion, others demand order and discipline. Saero represents only one possibility among many, and the other voices inside Pessoa do not accept his simplicity easily. One of them stands in quiet opposition. Where Cairo embraces pure perception, another identity insists on intellectual structure. Where Cairo dissolves metaphysics, this other voice rebuilds it through reason and restraint. Where Cairo celebrates the immediacy of nature, this figure looks toward destiny and the limits of human control. Within the same mind, a new perspective begins to emerge. Calm, stoic, disciplined. A voice that recognizes the fragility of life and responds not with sensory innocence, but with philosophical acceptance. And as this voice gradually takes shape, the question of how a human being should face the inevitability of fate begins to move to the center of the stage. Calm acceptance is not weakness. It is the discipline of seeing clearly what cannot be changed. Human beings spend enormous energy resisting the structure of reality. We dream of control, mastery, and permanence. Yet existence repeatedly reveals a harsher truth. Life unfolds according to forces that remain indifferent to human desire. This recognition stands at the center of another voice inside Pessoa's inner universe. Where Alberto Caeiro rejects interpretation and embraces direct perception, Ricardo Reis moves in a different direction. He does not deny thought, he refines it. His perspective carries the quiet gravity of ancient Stoicism. The world, according to this voice, is governed by inevitability. Fate is not an abstract concept. It is the invisible framework within which every human life unfolds. To resist it blindly is foolish. To understand it is wisdom. Ricardo Reis represents a mind that has accepted the limits of human power. His tone is calm, controlled, almost austere. Emotion does not dominate him. Passion does not overwhelm him. Instead, he cultivates distance from the turbulence of existence. Not because life lacks meaning, but because its fragility demands restraint. This perspective emerges from a long philosophical tradition. Long before modern psychology began analyzing anxiety and control, ancient thinkers already recognized the tension between human desire and the indifferent structure of the universe. Stoic philosophy taught that suffering often arises from confusion about what lies within our control and what does not. When human beings attempt to dominate what cannot be dominated, frustration becomes inevitable. Ricardo Reis carries this lesson into Pessoa's internal landscape. The world is not designed according to our wishes. Events unfold according to forces far larger than individual will. Time moves forward without negotiation. Death arrives without consultation. Chance interrupts plans without apology. To live wisely, therefore, requires a radical adjustment of expectation. Reis does not argue that life is meaningless. Instead, he insists that meaning must be cultivated within the boundaries imposed by fate. The wise person does not demand permanence from a temporary world. The wise person learns to exist gracefully inside transience. This position immediately confronts one of the deepest illusions of modern culture. Human beings love the fantasy of control. We celebrate ambition, mastery, and determination. The narrative of success often suggests that individuals can shape their destiny through willpower alone. Discipline becomes a weapon against uncertainty. Planning becomes a shield against unpredictability. But reality rarely obeys these narratives. Careers collapse despite preparation. Relationships dissolve despite devotion. Health disappears despite careful living. Even the most disciplined life eventually collides with forces beyond human management. Fate does not ask permission before reshaping existence. Ricardo Reis begins from this recognition. Instead of fighting the inevitable, he cultivates composure. Instead of demanding permanence, he appreciates the fleeting nature of every experience. His philosophy does not attempt to conquer fate. It seeks harmony with it. This harmony requires a particular psychological posture, restraint. In Rice's view, excessive passion is dangerous because it binds the soul too tightly to outcomes that cannot be guaranteed. When we attach ourselves intensely to expectations, disappointment becomes unavoidable. The world is simply too unstable to support absolute emotional investment. Therefore, he advocates a life of measured engagement. Enjoy what exists without demanding that it last forever. Appreciate beauty without expecting ownership. Accept pleasure without building identity upon it. The present moment becomes something to be experienced with quiet awareness rather than desperate attachment. This attitude can appear cold at first glance. Some may interpret race as emotionally distant, even detached from life. But this interpretation misunderstands his intention. Stoic calm is not indifference, it is clarity. It is the recognition that emotional excess often arises from illusions about permanence and control. Race does not reject joy, it simply refuses to cling to it. To understand this position fully, one must confront the psychological roots of human suffering. Much of our pain does not come from events themselves, but from the expectations we attach to them. We want success to last forever. We want love to remain unchanged. We want life itself to resist decay. Yet every aspect of existence contradicts these desires. Everything moves toward transformation. Time dissolves achievements. Memory reshapes the past. Bodies weaken. Circumstances shift. The structure of reality itself is impermanence. Rice accepts this without resentment. In doing so, he reveals a different kind of freedom. If nothing is permanent, then life can be experienced without the burden of absolute expectation. Moments become valuable precisely because they are fragile. Beauty gains intensity because it will vanish. This is the Stoic paradox. By accepting the limits of existence, one can live more peacefully within it. The relevance of this perspective becomes striking when we examine contemporary life. In the modern world, individuals are encouraged to believe that they should control every dimension of their destiny. Productivity culture demands constant optimization. Self-help narratives promise total mastery over circumstance. Failure is often interpreted as personal weakness rather than the natural unpredictability of existence. But reality continues to resist these fantasies. Even in 2025, despite technological advancement and scientific knowledge, human beings remain vulnerable to forces beyond their control. Economic instability, sudden illness, political upheaval, and the simple passage of time continue to reshape lives without warning. Ricardo Reis speaks directly to this condition. His calm voice reminds us that the desire for total control is itself a source of suffering. The world does not promise fairness. It does not guarantee stability. Wisdom, therefore, lies not in conquering fate, but in learning to coexist with it. This coexistence requires inner discipline. Reis cultivates emotional moderation. He observes life with dignity rather than desperation. His philosophy encourages individuals to engage with existence while remaining aware of its limits. One participates in life fully, yet never forgets its transience. This perspective creates a delicate balance. Too much detachment can drain life of vitality. Too much attachment can drown the soul in disappointment. The Stoic path attempts to navigate between these extremes. Pessoa understood the importance of this balance within his own psychological experiment. If Caedo represents pure perception without interpretation, Reich represents structured awareness of the limits imposed by fate. One dissolves philosophy into sensation. The other disciplines emotion through philosophical restraint. Together, they reveal different responses to the fragility of existence. But the inner universe of Pessoa does not stop there. Another voice begins to rise within the same mind, and this voice refuses calm restraint entirely. Where race values moderation, this new figure explodes with intensity. Where race accepts limits, this voice demands experience without boundaries. Emotion returns, but now in its most extreme form. Modernity itself seems to surge through this next identity like electricity through a wire. The speed of cities, the noise of machines, the fever of progress, the hunger to feel everything at once. Within this voice, the disciplined calm of Stoicism shatters, replaced by a burning desire to live every possible sensation before time erases the opportunity. And as this restless figure begins to speak, the philosophy of moderation suddenly collides with something far more volatile. To desire everything is to invite chaos into the soul. Yet there are moments in human consciousness when moderation feels like suffocation. Calm restraint begins to resemble paralysis. The stoic distance that Ricardo Reis cultivates suddenly appears too quiet, too controlled, too lifeless. A new voice rises from the depths of Pessoa's internal universe and shatters that stillness. This voice refuses moderation. It demands intensity. Álvaro de Campos enters like a storm, tearing through disciplined philosophy. Where race accepts fate with composure, Campos confronts existence with explosive hunger. He does not seek balance. He seeks experience in its most extreme forms. Sensation, movement, speed, noise, desire. Everything must be lived at full volume. Campos represents a completely different response to the fragility of life. If the world is temporary, he argues, then restraint becomes absurd. Why approach existence cautiously when time itself is racing toward extinction? Why moderate emotion when consciousness itself is brief? For Campos, the logical answer is excess. To live is to burn through experience with relentless intensity. This is not simple hedonism. Campos is not merely chasing pleasure. His obsession is deeper. He wants to feel the entire spectrum of existence, every emotion, every sensation, every contradiction. His ambition is almost impossible. He wants to live more life than one human body can contain. This hunger defines the emotional architecture of modernity. The industrial age transformed the pace of human experience. Cities expanded, machines accelerated time, technology multiplied stimuli. The calm rhythm of traditional life was replaced by movement, speed, and constant transformation. Human consciousness suddenly found itself surrounded by noise, electricity, engines, and endless possibility. Campos becomes the poetic embodiment of that transformation. He feels the pulse of the modern world like an electric current inside his nerves. Ships crossing oceans, factories roaring, trains racing across landscapes, cities glowing with artificial light. The entire machinery of modern civilization floods his imagination with energy. Where Cairo saw quiet fields and simple reality, Campos sees turbines and steel. Where race contemplates fate with calm acceptance. Campos shouts against the sky in ecstatic defiance. His philosophy is simple and terrifying. Experience everything. Not gradually, not carefully, immediately, completely. This demand reveals a psychological truth that still shapes modern existence. Human beings possess an endless appetite for stimulation. Once the world becomes accessible, the desire to explore it multiplies rapidly. Each new sensation creates the hunger for another. Campos embodies this appetite without restraint. He dreams of living every life at once, every city, every love, every adventure, every emotion. The limitation of a single body becomes unbearable to him. Consciousness itself feels too small to contain the immensity of the world. Here we encounter a profound existential tension. Human imagination expands far beyond the limits of human life. We can imagine infinite experiences, yet our existence allows only a finite number of them. The gap between possibility and reality creates a restless dissatisfaction that defines modern consciousness. Campos feels this tension more intensely than any other voice inside Pessoa. His poetry vibrates with excitement and despair simultaneously. He celebrates the overwhelming energy of modern civilization, yet he also senses the emptiness hiding behind it. The faster life moves, the more it risks becoming hollow. This contradiction sits at the center of his philosophy. Modernity promises intensity. It promises expansion, exploration, progress. But the very speed that excites us can also exhaust us. The flood of experiences can become so overwhelming that meaning begins to dissolve. Campos feels both sides of this paradox. He's intoxicated by movement, yet haunted by emptiness. The city dazzles him, yet it also isolates him. Technology excites him, yet it reveals the mechanical nature of existence. The more sensations he consumes, the more he realizes that no amount of experience can permanently satisfy the human soul. This realization introduces a darker layer to his voice. Intensity cannot erase existential emptiness. It can only distract from it temporarily. The modern world often encourages the belief that constant stimulation will produce happiness. Entertainment multiplies, travel becomes easier, communication accelerates. The promise is simple: experience more and life will become richer. But Campos reveals the hidden flaw in this promise. Experience alone does not guarantee meaning. The more sensations he accumulates, the more aware he becomes of the limits of sensation itself. Pleasure fades quickly. Excitement demands escalation. The mind adapts rapidly to new stimuli, turning yesterday's thrill into today's normality. This endless escalation creates a strange psychological fatigue. The soul begins to feel overloaded. The nervous system struggles to process the avalanche of impressions. Instead of fulfillment, a subtle emptiness begins to grow beneath the surface of excitement. Campos senses this emptiness with brutal honesty. His enthusiasm for modern life often collapses suddenly into exhaustion. The same energy that drives him forward also threatens to consume him. His desire to feel everything reveals the impossibility of that desire. No human being can live every life. No consciousness can contain every experience. The recognition of this limit produces a painful awareness. Human existence will always be incomplete. No matter how intensely we live, there will always remain countless possibilities that we will never touch. Campos responds to this truth not with resignation, but with desperate intensity. If life must be incomplete, then at least it must be intense. If experience cannot be infinite, then it must be overwhelming. He throws himself into sensation not because it solves the existential problem, but because it temporarily silences it. This attitude mirrors a pattern visible in contemporary culture. Even in 2025, the modern world continues to accelerate. Information flows faster. Technology evolves rapidly. Individuals chase experiences across continents and digital spaces. The fear of missing out becomes a constant psychological pressure. The logic behind this behavior is unmistakably similar to Campos's philosophy. Live more, see more, feel more. But beneath that urgency hides a quiet anxiety, the fear that life might pass without enough intensity, the fear that existence might feel ordinary, the fear that meaning might slip away unnoticed. Campos amplifies this anxiety until it becomes almost unbearable. His voice is ecstatic, desperate, brilliant, and unstable. He represents the emotional explosion that occurs when human desire collides with the infinite possibilities of the modern world. Yet even this explosive energy cannot silence the deeper question. What happens when sensation itself becomes overwhelming? What happens when the flood of experience begins to blur the boundary between reality and imagination? Campos pushes consciousness toward that threshold. The more intensely he lives, the more unstable the border between the external world and the inner mind becomes. Experience begins to feel dreamlike. The speed of modern life distorts perception. Reality itself starts to resemble a hallucination created by movement and sensation. And once that boundary begins to dissolve, a new realization slowly emerges from the shadows of consciousness. Perhaps life itself is not as solid as we assume. Perhaps the distinction between reality and dream is thinner than we imagine. Perhaps human beings move through existence as if half awake, constructing meaning inside a world that often feels strangely unreal. Reality begins to dissolve the moment we realize how fragile our certainty about it truly is. Human beings move through existence convinced that a world around them is stable, objective, and clearly separated from imagination. Yet, consciousness itself quietly undermines that confidence. Perception is filtered through memory, emotion, language, and expectation. What we call reality may already be shaped by the inner theater of the mind. Once this suspicion appears, it becomes impossible to ignore. If the self is fragmented, if perception changes according to the voice that dominates consciousness, and if experience itself can overwhelm the mind, as Alvaro de Campos discovered, then a deeper possibility begins to emerge. Perhaps reality and imagination are not cleanly separated domains. Perhaps human beings live in a state closer to dreaming than they dare admit. This is where another layer of Pessoa's philosophical experiment begins to unfold. Life may feel solid, but our awareness of it is strangely unstable. We wake in the morning believing that the day will follow a predictable path. We perform routines, speak familiar words, move through familiar streets. Everything appears ordinary. Yet, beneath this ordinary surface lies an unsettling fact. Much of what we experience is filtered through internal narratives that we rarely examine. The mind constantly edits reality. It selects what to notice. It ignores countless details. It fills gaps with assumptions. It transforms raw perception into meaningful patterns. In doing so, it constructs a version of the world that feels coherent. But coherence is not the same as objective truth. Human beings do not experience reality directly. They experience a psychological interpretation of it. This realization becomes deeply disturbing once it is fully understood. If perception itself is partly constructed by the mind, then the boundary between reality and imagination becomes uncertain. The difference between waking life and dreaming begins to blur. Pessoa understood this tension intimately. Within his inner landscape, the multiplicity of voices reveal that consciousness does not operate as a single, stable observer. Each identity interprets the world differently. Each transforms experience into a unique narrative. The result is a profound philosophical suspicion. The world we inhabit may not be the same world experienced by another mind. And even within the same individual, reality can shift dramatically. Consider how memory reshapes the past. Events that once seemed insignificant become meaningful years later. Painful moments soften with time. Joyful experiences fade into abstraction. The mind reconstructs the past continuously, transforming it according to new interpretations. If the past itself is unstable, what about the present? The present moment feels immediate, yet even it is shaped by expectation. We rarely encounter events without projecting meaning onto them. The mind anticipates outcomes, imagines consequences, and frames experiences through emotional context. In this sense, human beings are always partially dreaming. Not in the literal sense of sleep, but in the psychological sense of living within mental constructions. Our perceptions are interwoven with imagination so tightly that separating them becomes difficult. This condition produces a peculiar form of existence. People move through life performing roles that feel natural, yet those roles are partly narratives learned from society. We adopt identities shaped by culture, language, and expectation. We behave according to scripts that feel authentic, yet those scripts were written long before we became aware of them. The result is a quiet form of sleepwalking. Human beings act, speak, and decide, while rarely questioning the deeper structure of their consciousness. They assume that their identity is stable. They assume that their perceptions are accurate. They assume that the world they see is the world that exists. But occasionally, something disrupts this illusion. A moment of intense self-awareness can strike unexpectedly. It might appear during solitude, during crisis, or during an ordinary moment when a mind suddenly observes itself thinking. In that instant, the familiar narrative of identity begins to tremble. The individual becomes aware of their own awareness. And the effect can be disorienting. Suddenly, the routines of life feel strange. Actions that once seemed automatic become objects of observation. Thoughts that once felt natural begin to appear constructed. The individual realizes that the sense of self guiding their actions may be less stable than previously assumed. This is the shock of awakening. The Pessoa's writing often circles around this psychological experience. His characters sense that life resembles a dream, not because the external world is unreal, but because consciousness itself is unstable. The mind constructs meaning continuously, and those constructions can collapse at any moment. When that collapse occurs, existence becomes strangely transparent. The person sees themselves as both actor and observer. They recognize the artificial nature of certain beliefs, roles, and ambitions. The narratives that once provided direction suddenly appear fragile. This awareness can feel liberating. It can also feel terrifying, because once the illusion of complete certainty dissolves, human beings must confront a difficult question. If the self is constructed and perception is filtered through imagination, then how much of life rests on assumptions rather than truth? This question has haunted philosophers for centuries, but Pessoa approached it from a uniquely psychological angle. Instead of seeking abstract metaphysical answers, he explored the internal experience of uncertainty itself. His heteronyms reveal how consciousness navigates a world that sometimes feels both real and dreamlike simultaneously. The modern world intensifies this tension even further. In the contemporary era, human beings are surrounded by images, narratives, and digital environments that blur the boundary between reality and simulation. People spend hours inside virtual spaces, absorbing stories, identities, and experiences that exist only through technology. Even in 2025, this phenomenon continues to deepen. Social media allows individuals to present curated versions of themselves. Online environments simulate social interaction. Artificial imagery can imitate reality with startling precision. The result is a culture where the distinction between lived experience and constructed representation becomes increasingly difficult to define. Pessoa anticipated this psychological condition long before it became technologically visible. His insight was simple but unsettling. Human consciousness already operates within layers of imagination. Technology merely amplifies a process that has always existed within the mind. The danger lies not in imagination itself, but in forgetting that it exists. When individuals lose awareness of the narratives shaping their perception, they begin to mistake those narratives for objective reality. They become trapped inside stories that they themselves helped construct. This is the deeper meaning of sleepwalking through life. To live unconsciously is to accept every internal narrative as truth. To live consciously is to recognize that the mind constantly shapes the world it perceives. Pessoa's exploration of identity, perception, and imagination gradually leads toward a disturbing paradox. The more deeply a person understands their own consciousness, the less solid the idea of a stable self appears. Self-awareness reveals fragmentation. Perception reveals interpretation. Experience reveals uncertainty. Knowledge begins to dissolve certainty. Yet human beings cannot abandon the search for self-understanding. The desire to know who we are remains powerful, even when the answers become unstable. And here, another contradiction begins to surface. The deeper we look into ourselves, the more we encounter emptiness where we expected clarity. The search for a stable identity often leads not to discovery, but to dissolution. The self becomes increasingly difficult to define the more intensely it is examined. And slowly a troubling realization emerges from this process of introspection. Perhaps the greatest paradox of human existence is that the pursuit of self-knowledge may gradually erode the very identity we are trying to understand. The search for the self does not always reveal clarity. Often it reveals absence. Human beings believe that if they examine themselves deeply enough, they will eventually uncover a stable core, a definitive identity that explains their thoughts, desires, and choices. Yet the deeper introspection goes, the more unsettling the discovery becomes. The self begins to dissolve under the weight of its own examination. This is the paradox of self-knowledge. To understand oneself completely may be impossible because the act of observing the self changes the self that is being observed. Consciousness turns inward, analyzes its own movements, and in doing so, disrupts the illusion of stability that once sustained it. The more carefully we inspect our identity, the less solid it appears. Fernando Pessoa understood this paradox with ruthless clarity. After exposing the fragmentation of identity, after allowing multiple voices to inhabit the same consciousness, and after questioning the reliability of perception itself, another question inevitably emerges. What happens when a human being attempts to know themselves completely? The answer is not comfort. Self-awareness often produces a strange emptiness. At the beginning of life, identity feels simple. A person believes they know who they are. They possess preferences, ambitions, beliefs, and habits. These elements combine into what appears to be a coherent personality. The individual moves through the world guided by this sense of continuity. But introspection begins to erode that certainty. The moment someone begins to observe their own thoughts, a separation appears. The mind that thinks and the mind that observes are not the same. One part of consciousness produces ideas, emotions, and impulses. Another part watches them appear. This division introduces instability. If the observing self is watching the thinking self, then which one is the real identity? And if a deeper level of observation emerges that watches both of them, then where exactly does the true self exist? The structure begins to resemble an infinite mirror. Each attempt to define the self produces another layer of awareness, observing that definition. The result is a recursive process with no final foundation. Identity becomes a moving target that retreats each time we approach it. Pessoa did not treat this phenomenon as a purely philosophical curiosity. For him, it was a lived psychological experience. His heteronyms already demonstrated that one mind could contain several identities. But even beyond these constructed personalities lies a deeper instability. The consciousness that observes these identities cannot easily define itself either. Who is the observer behind all the voices? This question exposes the most unsettling aspect of introspection. The more closely we examine the structure of consciousness, the more we encounter a strange absence at its center. The self begins to feel like a stage rather than a performer. Thoughts appear, speak briefly, and disappear. Emotions rise and fade. Desires ignite and collapse. The mind hosts these experiences, but it does not fully control them. Consciousness begins to resemble a space through which psychological events pass. And within that space, a stable identity becomes difficult to locate. This realization produces a deep existential tension. Human beings require a sense of self in order to function. Responsibility, morality, and purpose all depend on the assumption that a consistent individual exists behind our actions. Yet introspection weakens that assumption. The more we analyze the self, the more fragile it appears. Pessoa's exploration of identity moves directly into this tension. His writing suggests that complete self-understanding may actually destroy the illusion of a unified personality. The deeper the investigation goes, the more the structure of identity reveals its own emptiness. This is not the comforting narrative that modern culture prefers. Many contemporary voices promise that self-knowledge will lead to empowerment and clarity. They encourage individuals to discover their true identity, to unlock their authentic nature, to find the stable core that defines them. The assumption behind these promises is simple. If we understand ourselves completely, life will become more coherent. Pessoa suggests the opposite. Understanding the self may reveal that coherence itself was always partly imagined. Even in 2025, the search for identity dominates cultural conversation. People speak constantly about self-discovery, personal branding, psychological alignment, and authenticity. The modern individual feels pressure to define themselves clearly and confidently. But beneath this cultural expectation lies a quiet fear. What if the self we are trying to discover does not exist as a single, stable entity? What if identity is not something waiting to be uncovered, but something continuously assembled from changing experiences? This possibility makes self-knowledge far more complicated than we would like to admit. The human mind contains contradictory desires. It contains conflicting values. It contains emotional patterns that change over time. To examine these elements honestly is to encounter a personality that refuses simple definition. Pessoa's heteronyms illustrate this complexity dramatically. Each internal voice represents a possible version of identity. One sees the world through sensation, another through stoic discipline, another through explosive modern emotion. These personalities are not superficial masks. They are fully realized perspectives capable of interpreting existence in completely different ways. If one individual can contain such diversity, then the idea of a single essential self becomes questionable. Yet the paradox deepens even further. When a person becomes aware of this multiplicity, they often experience a strange sense of detachment from their own identity. The individual begins to watch their thoughts as if they belong to someone else. Emotions appear less absolute, beliefs less permanent. The self begins to feel like an observer rather than an owner. This shift can produce a profound form of existential vertigo. Without a stable center, life becomes psychologically unstable. Decisions feel less certain. Motivations become ambiguous. The sense of continuity that once guided action begins to weaken. And yet human beings cannot function without some degree of illusion. Complete self-awareness would paralyze existence. If every thought were constantly examined, every impulse analyzed, every identity questioned, daily life would become impossible. Action requires a temporary suspension of doubt. It requires the ability to inhabit an identity without dissecting it continuously. Pessoa recognized this necessity. Human beings require a certain degree of blindness in order to live. Not total ignorance, but selective unawareness. A person must sometimes accept the temporary stability of their identity without analyzing it completely. Without this psychological compromise, consciousness would collapse into endless self-observation. This insight reveals the hidden balance within human existence. Too little self-awareness produces unconscious living. A person moves through life guided by assumptions they never question. But too much self-awareness produces paralysis. The individual becomes trapped in analysis, unable to act with conviction. Wisdom lies somewhere between these extremes. Pessoa's exploration of the self suggests that identity is not a fixed discovery, but a dynamic process. Human beings must continually construct themselves from shifting elements of thought, emotion, and experience. The self becomes something that must be lived rather than fully understood. And yet, even this conclusion does not settle the tension. Because once we recognize that identity is constructed, another question emerges with quiet intensity. If the self is something we assemble, then what role does creativity play in that construction? At this point, the exploration of identity begins to move toward another dimension of Pessoa's philosophy. The mind does not merely observe and interpret experience, it also creates. And through that act of creation, human beings begin to transform emotion itself into something new. Art does not mirror reality, it manufactures sensation. Human beings often believe that art exists to represent the world faithfully, to reproduce landscapes, emotions, and experiences as they appear. But this assumption misunderstands the deeper function of artistic creation. Art does not simply reflect reality, it reorganizes the inner life of the human being. This insight stands at the center of Pessoa's understanding of creativity. After confronting the instability of the self, after realizing that identity dissolves under intense introspection, another possibility emerges from the ruins of certainty. If the self is not fixed, if personality is a construction rather than a discovery, then perhaps art is the laboratory where this construction becomes visible. Pessoa understood that the artist does not merely express feelings, the artist manufactures them. Emotion in ordinary life is chaotic. It appears unexpectedly, rises without structure, and disappears without explanation. Human beings experience joy, despair, fear, and longing as unpredictable currents moving through consciousness. But the artist performs a different operation. Instead of simply feeling emotions, the artist reorganizes them into deliberate forms. Poetry, literature, and music become architectures of sensation. In this process, the artist transforms personal experience into something that can be transmitted, repeated, and intensified. A fleeting emotion becomes a structured, aesthetic experience. A private feeling becomes a shared human moment. Pessoa pushed this transformation further than most creators dared. His heteronyms were not merely literary devices. They were instruments designed to generate distinct emotional worlds. Each internal author produced a different atmosphere of feeling. Each voice reorganized experience according to its own psychological logic. The result was extraordinary. Through Alberto Sairo, the reader feels the raw simplicity of perception. Through Ricardo Reis, the reader senses disciplined calm in the face of fate. Through Alvaro de Campos, the reader experiences the electric turbulence of modern life. These emotions are not accidental, they are carefully constructed. Pessoa does not simply describe a feeling, he builds the conditions that produce it. This is why his work reveals something fundamental about the nature of art itself. Art is not the direct expression of emotion. It is the engineering of emotion. The artist becomes an architect of inner experience. Consider what happens when someone reads a poem. The reader does not merely observe words on a page. Those words trigger sensations, memories, and emotional responses. The poem constructs a psychological environment inside the reader's mind. Through rhythm, imagery, and structure, the artist guides perception toward a specific emotional state. This process reveals a powerful truth. Emotion itself can be designed. Pessoa understood that the artist is not simply someone who feels deeply. Many people feel intensely without producing art. What distinguishes the artist is the ability to transform raw emotion into deliberate form. Feeling becomes structure. Structure becomes experience. In this transformation, the artist's personal identity begins to dissolve. The creator becomes a channel through which multiple emotional realities can emerge. Pessoa himself described this phenomenon with striking clarity. The poet does not merely feel one emotion. The poet creates the capacity to feel many emotions that may not even belong to his personal life. This idea challenges the romantic myth of artistic authenticity. Many believe that art must come directly from the artist's personal feelings. They imagine creativity as a confession of the soul, a transparent window into the creator's inner life. But Pessoa dismantles this belief. Art does not require the artist to feel what is written. The artist constructs emotional experiences that can exist independently of personal biography. A poet can create grief without currently suffering. A writer can create passion without being consumed by it. The emotion in art becomes something crafted rather than merely lived. Pessoa's heteronyms demonstrate this principle with almost scientific precision. Each internal voice possesses its own emotional logic. Saero feels serenity in the presence of nature. Rice experiences dignified calm before destiny. Campos burns with restless intensity. These emotional universes coexist within the same author, yet they contradict each other completely. This contradiction reveals a profound insight about human creativity. The artist does not possess a single emotional identity. Instead, the artist contains multiple potential sensibilities that can be activated through imagination and language. Writing becomes a method of entering different psychological states. In this sense, the artist resembles an actor performing roles inside the theater of consciousness. Each role produces its own emotional reality. Each voice constructs a different atmosphere of meaning. Through this process, the boundaries between identity and creation begin to blur. Pessoa becomes less a single writer and more a system generating experiences. This system exposes the deeper relationship between art and human psychology. Human beings already contain multiple emotional potentials within their minds. Everyday life activates only a portion of them. Social roles, responsibilities, and habits limit the range of emotions we allow ourselves to express. Art breaks those limitations. Through imagination, the artist explores emotional territories that ordinary life rarely permits. Joy can be intensified. Despair can be magnified. Serenity can be expanded into philosophical vision. Art becomes a laboratory where human feeling is examined, reconstructed, and amplified. The relevance of this insight becomes even more visible in the modern era. In contemporary culture, people constantly consume artistic experiences designed to generate emotion. Films, music, literature, and digital media shape collective feeling on a massive scale. Entire industries revolve around the deliberate production of emotional states. Even in 2025, the architecture of sensation dominates human attention. People seek experiences that make them feel something powerful: excitement, nostalgia, awe, melancholy. Art provides access to emotional landscapes that everyday life cannot easily produce. Pessoa anticipated this phenomenon in a deeply philosophical way. He recognized that art does not merely entertain, it reorganizes the way individuals experience their own emotions. A powerful poem can change how a person perceives love. A novel can reshape the experience of loneliness. A piece of music can transform grief into something strangely beautiful. The artist therefore becomes more than a storyteller. The artist becomes a constructor of perception. Yet this power carries an existential tension. If emotions can be constructed through art, then how much of what we feel in life is shaped by narratives we have absorbed from culture? How many of our feelings are authentic responses to experience? And how many are patterns learned through stories, songs, and images? Pessoa's work quietly raises this unsettling question. The boundary between lived emotion and constructed emotion begins to blur. The same imagination that creates art also shapes personal identity. Human beings internalize emotional scripts from the world around them and reproduce those scripts in their own lives. Art influences reality more than we often realize. But there is also another side to this dynamic. Art not only shapes emotion, it also reveals something painful about the nature of the artist's life. To construct emotions repeatedly can produce distance from direct experience. The artist who transforms feelings into aesthetic form may begin to observe life rather than fully inhabit it. Emotion becomes material rather than immediate reality. Pessoa himself lived close to this paradox. His extraordinary capacity to create emotional worlds through different heteronyms also exposed him to a quiet isolation. The more perspectives he generated, the more difficult it became to inhabit a single, stable identity within ordinary life. Creation expands consciousness, but it can also fragment it. The artist becomes someone who experiences life through layers of interpretation. Reality is constantly transformed into language, image, and reflection. Instead of simply living, the artist is always partially observing, analyzing, and reconstructing experience. This tension reveals the hidden cost of artistic awareness. To see the emotional architecture of existence is to recognize how fragile ordinary identity truly is. The more clearly a person understands the mechanisms shaping emotion and perception, the more difficult it becomes to participate in life without distance. Pessoa's exploration of art therefore leads to a darker realization. The same sensitivity that allows deep insight can also create profound solitude. When the mind sees too many perspectives, too many emotional possibilities, the stability of the self begins to weaken again. And slowly the consequences of this fragmentation begin to appear. Because when identity becomes unstable, when emotion becomes something constructed rather than simply lived, action itself starts to become difficult. The individual who sees too many interpretations of existence may find it increasingly hard to commit to any single path. And in that moment, the philosophical exploration of multiplicity begins to reveal its most painful dimension. Too much awareness can break the ability to live. Human beings often assume that knowledge strengthens the individual, that deeper understanding leads naturally to wisdom, clarity, and stability. But there exists another possibility that philosophers rarely admit openly. Sometimes knowledge fractures the very structure that allows life to move forward. This is the tragedy hidden inside fragmentation. When a person begins to see multiple perspectives simultaneously, certainty dissolves. Every belief reveals its opposite. Every conviction exposes its own weakness. The mind becomes capable of observing reality from too many angles at once. What once felt obvious becomes questionable. What once guided action becomes uncertain. And slowly, a dangerous paralysis begins to form. Fernando Pessoa understood this danger intimately. His exploration of multiple identities was not merely a creative triumph, it was also a psychological burden. The more voices that appeared within his inner universe, the more difficult it became to act with the simplicity required by ordinary life. Multiplicity expands thought but complicates existence. Every decision requires commitments to one direction while abandoning countless alternatives. But a mind that perceives too many possibilities begins to hesitate. Action demands the illusion of certainty. Fragmentation removes that illusion. The result is a quiet form of existential isolation. Pessoa's internal voices could debate endlessly. Kaido could insist on the purity of perception. Reich could advocate stoic restraint. Campos could demand explosive experience. Each perspective possessed its own logic, its own emotional truth. But when these perspectives coexist within one consciousness, which voice should act? This question reveals the deeper tragedy of intellectual fragmentation. Thought multiplies faster than life can respond. Philosophy opens doors endlessly. It reveals contradictions hidden beneath everyday assumptions. It exposes illusions that once gave stability to identity. Yet once those illusions collapse, the individual must confront a world that feels strangely uncertain. The ordinary person moves through life, guided by simplified narratives. They believe in stable identity, clear purpose, and coherent meaning. These beliefs may not always be philosophically accurate, but they provide psychological structure. Pessoa removed those structures. He dismantled the myth of a unified self. He questioned the reliability of perception. He exposed the constructed nature of emotion. He demonstrated that identity could split into multiple autonomous perspectives. Each revelation expanded understanding. Each revelation also weakened the ground beneath his feet. The tragedy of fragmentation is not simply confusion, it is loneliness. When a person sees too many layers of reality, communication with others becomes more difficult. Ordinary conversation assumes shared assumptions about identity and meaning. Most people operate within a framework that treats the self as stable and the world as straightforward. But the fragmented mind cannot fully return to that simplicity. It becomes aware of the mechanisms shaping identity. It sees the narratives behind emotion. It observes the illusions sustaining social life. This awareness creates distance between the individual and the collective experience of reality. Pessoa lived inside that distance. His life outwardly appeared quiet, almost ordinary. He worked as a translator. He walked the streets of Lisbon. He spent long hours writing. Yet internally, his consciousness was populated by multiple authors arguing about the meaning of existence. The outer life remained still, while the inner life exploded with philosophical tension. This contrast reveals a painful dimension of intellectual awareness. The more deeply a person examines existence, the harder it becomes to participate in life with innocence. Ordinary ambitions lose their urgency when the structure of identity itself appears unstable. Social roles begin to feel theatrical. Even personal desires become objects of analysis rather than unquestioned motivations. Life becomes something observed. The philosopher watches the world while others simply live within it. This observational distance can produce remarkable insight, but it also carries a cost. Action becomes difficult when every impulse is examined from multiple angles. Pessoa captured this condition through a quiet but devastating realization. To understand too much may weaken the capacity to live spontaneously. Human beings require a certain degree of illusion in order to act. We must believe that our choices matter. We must believe that our identity possesses some continuity. We must believe that our goals have meaning. These beliefs allow life to move forward. But philosophy often dismantles them. When the mind begins to question everything, the foundations of action begin to crumble. The individual sees that identity is fluid, that meaning is constructed, that perception is filtered through interpretation. Nothing remains entirely solid. This realization can lead to intellectual brilliance. It can also produce paralysis. Pessoa's writing often reflects this tension between awareness and action. His heteronyms are vibrant thinkers, yet they rarely transform their insights into decisive movement within the world. They analyze, reflect, and interpret, but the energy of thought rarely becomes the energy of life. The mind becomes active while the body remains still. This condition resembles what existential philosophers later described as the burden of consciousness. To be aware of the complexities of existence is both a privilege and a curse. Awareness expands freedom, but it also exposes uncertainty. Every possibility becomes visible. Every path reveals its limitations. The fragmented self becomes trapped between alternatives. One voice urges calm acceptance of fate. Another demands passionate experience. Another seeks pure perception beyond thought. Each perspective carries partial truth. None offers absolute certainty. The individual becomes a battlefield of philosophies, and within that battlefield, action begins to slow. Pessoa's life illustrates the quiet tragedy of this condition. He produced extraordinary literature, yet much of his personal existence remained solitary and restrained. His intellectual universe expanded endlessly, while his external life remained narrow. This contrast is not accidental. It reveals the hidden consequence of seeing too much. The more perspectives consciousness contains, the more difficult it becomes to choose a single direction with conviction. The individual becomes aware that every decision excludes countless other possibilities. Action begins to feel arbitrary, and when action feels arbitrary, hesitation grows. Modern life amplifies this dilemma even further. In the contemporary world, individuals are constantly exposed to multiple perspectives. Information flows from every direction. Cultural narratives collide. Philosophical ideas circulate widely. People are encouraged to question assumptions, explore identities, and analyze their inner lives. Even in 2025, the multiplication of perspectives continues to accelerate. The modern mind resembles Pessoa's inner landscape more than ever before. Individuals encounter competing worldviews daily. Every belief is challenged by alternative interpretations. Every identity can be re-examined and reconstructed. This intellectual richness creates opportunity. It also creates instability. The human psyche was not originally designed to navigate endless philosophical alternatives simultaneously. Too many perspectives can produce uncertainty about how to live. Pessoa sensed this long before the digital age intensified the problem. His exploration of identity revealed both the beauty and the danger of multiplicity. The human mind contains astonishing creative potential, but that potential can fragment the sense of self if it expands without balance. And here the deepest tragedy emerges. When identity loses stability, belonging becomes fragile. The individual may feel detached from both society and themselves. The world continues moving forward, but the fragmented consciousness remains caught in reflection. Yet even within this tragedy lies another possibility. Multiplicity does not only produce paralysis, it also reveals something extraordinary about human nature. The same fragmentation that creates inner conflict also exposes the vast range of potential identities contained within every individual. And if that multiplicity can be understood not as a weakness, but as a source of possibility, then the fragmented self may no longer appear tragic at all. Multiplicity is not a defect of the human soul. It is its hidden architecture. For centuries, people have feared the instability of identity. They have treated contradiction inside the self as weakness, confusion, or psychological disorder. Yet Fernando Pessoa's philosophical experiment points toward a radically different conclusion. The human being is not meant to be singular. A person is a universe of possible selves. The tragedy we explored before emerges only when multiplicity is misunderstood. When individuals believe they must possess a single coherent identity, every contradiction inside them becomes a threat. Different desires create guilt. Different perspectives create doubt. Different emotional tendencies feel like internal conflict. But what if these contradictions are not errors? What if they are evidence of the mind's vast capacity? Pessoa's inner landscape offers a striking answer. Within one individual consciousness existed a poet of pure perception, a philosopher of stoic calm, a modern soul burning with sensation, and many other subtle voices between them. Each perspective was not a mistake. Each represented a genuine mode of experiencing existence. Together, they formed a constellation. This constellation reveals something fundamental about human nature. Identity is not a fixed structure waiting to be discovered. It is a field of possibilities waiting to be lived. To understand this is to dismantle one of the most persistent myths about the self. Society often insists that maturity means discovering who you truly are. The phrase appears everywhere. People are told to search within themselves for the authentic identity that defines their life. The assumption behind this advice seems reasonable. Somewhere beneath our confusion must lie a stable essence. Pessoa quietly dismantles this assumption. The search for a single true self may be misguided because the human mind is not built around singularity. Instead, it contains multiple tendencies that can develop into different identities depending on circumstance, experience, and choice. A person does not contain one destiny. A person contains many possible lives. This insight transforms the meaning of internal contradiction. When someone feels torn between different desires or perspectives, They often interpret this as psychological weakness, but in reality, it may simply reflect the richness of their internal universe. Multiple selves do not necessarily cancel each other. They expand the range of what a human being can become. Pessoa's heteronyms demonstrate this expansion vividly. Each identity within his writing represents a complete worldview, a different method of engaging with existence. Through Sairo, the world appears simple and immediate. Through race, it becomes disciplined and dignified. Through Campos, it explodes with modern intensity. These identities are not fragments of a broken self. They are manifestations of possibility. To recognize this possibility requires courage. Most people prefer stability to complexity. A single identity feels safe because it provides continuity. It allows individuals to explain their past and predict their future. Multiplicity introduces uncertainty. If identity is not fixed, then life becomes an open field of transformation. The person you are today does not fully determine the person you may become tomorrow. Personality becomes fluid rather than permanent. For some, this fluidity feels threatening, but it also carries extraordinary freedom. The human being is not imprisoned by a predetermined psychological structure. People can cultivate new ways of thinking, feeling, and perceiving the world. Identity can evolve as consciousness expands. Pessoa understood this dynamic not as self-improvement in the conventional sense, but as existential exploration. His writing suggests that the human mind resembles a vast landscape containing multiple potential paths. Some paths emphasize calm observation. Others pursue emotional intensity. Others cultivate intellectual discipline. No single path defines the entire terrain. The individual who understands this complexity begins to see identity differently. Instead of asking a rigid question like, "Who am I?" a more honest question emerges. Which version of myself is speaking now? This shift in perspective transforms self-awareness. Identity becomes something dynamic rather than fixed. The mind begins to observe its own changing patterns without forcing them into artificial unity. Pessoa's philosophy invites us to see the self as a dialogue rather than a monologue. Different voices inside consciousness can coexist without destroying one another. Each voice offers a particular lens through which the world can be experienced. Rather than suppressing this diversity, a person can learn to navigate it. This navigation becomes a subtle art. One moment may require the clarity of perception that Sairo represents. Another moment may demand the stoic acceptance embodied by race. Another moment may unleash the passionate intensity of Campos. Life becomes richer when multiple perspectives remain available. The challenge lies not in eliminating these voices, but in allowing them to coexist without losing direction. This idea has powerful implications for modern life. In the contemporary world, identity is increasingly fluid. People change careers, cultures, and environments more frequently than previous generations. Digital spaces allow individuals to present different versions of themselves simultaneously. The modern mind is constantly negotiating between roles, perspectives, and possibilities. Even in 2025, the pressure to define oneself clearly remains strong. Society still asks individuals to present a consistent narrative about who they are. Professional systems demand stable identities. Social expectations reward predictability. The language of authenticity still implies that somewhere beneath our contradictions lies a single, definitive self. Pessoa challenges that assumption. Authenticity may not mean discovering one true identity. It may mean acknowledging the multiplicity that already exists within us. To live authentically is not to erase internal contradiction. It is to accept that the human soul contains many potential expressions. This acceptance changes the emotional relationship we have with ourselves. Instead of fearing internal diversity, we begin to see it as a source of creative power. Each perspective within the mind becomes a resource rather than a threat. Pessoa's work demonstrates that this multiplicity can generate extraordinary creativity. His heteronyms allowed him to explore different philosophical positions without forcing them into artificial agreement. Instead of resolving contradictions, he allowed them to coexist. The result was not confusion, it was expansion. Through these internal dialogues, he revealed the vast psychological territory hidden inside a single human consciousness. Identity became less like a statue carved in stone and more like a living system evolving over time. This perspective leads toward a deeper philosophical realization. Human beings are not finished structures, they are ongoing processes. Each experience reshapes the internal landscape of the mind. New ideas introduce new perspectives. Emotional events alter the balance between internal voices. Identity evolves through continuous interaction between thought, sensation, and circumstance. The self is not something we possess, it is something we participate in. Pessoa's philosophical experiment, therefore, offers a different way of understanding the complexity of human existence. Instead of seeking a final answer to the question of identity, we begin to accept the openness of the question itself. The human being is not defined by a single narrative. Each person contains multiple narratives unfolding simultaneously. To live wisely may require learning how to inhabit this multiplicity without fear. Rather than forcing our internal voices into artificial unity, we can allow them to interact, challenge each other, and enrich our understanding of the world. Pessoa's legacy suggests that contradiction is not a failure of identity, it is evidence of its depth. And once a person begins to recognize this internal universe, another question naturally rises from the silence that follows. If the self contains so many possible versions of who we might become, then the real challenge of life may not be discovering a single true identity at all, but learning how to live with the many selves already waiting within us. Maturity does not mean discovering a single, unchanging identity. It means learning to live with the complexity inside us. Fernando Pessoa's philosophy forces us to confront a difficult truth. The human being is far less unified than we like to believe. Beneath the surface of everyday life exists a shifting landscape of thoughts, desires, and perspectives that rarely form a perfect harmony. What we call the self is both real and constructed. Throughout this exploration, we have seen how the illusion of a stable ego begins to dissolve. The self fractures into multiple voices. Perception changes depending on which voice speaks. Fate limits our control. Sensation overwhelms us. Introspection exposes emptiness, and art reveals how emotions themselves can be shaped and recreated. Each step removes another layer of certainty about what it means to be a single person. Yet, this fragmentation is not simply a tragedy. Pessoa's vision suggests something more subtle and more powerful. Human beings are not defined by a single fixed identity. We are defined by the dynamic coexistence of many possible selves. Within each individual lies a vast inner universe of perspectives waiting to emerge. The real challenge of life is not eliminating these contradictions. The real challenge is learning how to live with them. Modern culture often pressures us to present a clear and consistent version of who we are. We are told to define ourselves, to discover our authentic identity, to remain stable in a world that constantly changes. But Pessoa reveals that this demand may be unrealistic. Identity is not a finished structure. It is an evolving process shaped by experience, thought, and imagination. To grow as a human being may therefore require a different kind of courage, not the courage to find a final answer to the question of who we are, but the courage to accept that the question may never have a single answer. Pessoa's philosophy leaves us with an unsettling but liberating possibility. The self is neither completely real nor entirely fictional. It is a story we continuously create while living it. And perhaps true maturity does not come from discovering one definitive version of ourselves, but from learning how to exist honestly among the many versions that already live within us.